So we've already worked on the timeline a little bit in our last video, but now let's dive all the way in. Before we do, look over here and check out this button. This is the Animate button. Make sure this is turned off for right now. I'll show you what it does in a minute. Before we go any further, let's take a step back and try to get our minds around the metaphors that Harmony is built around. Even though Harmony can do some pretty technologically sophisticated stuff, the terminology it uses is all based in traditional hand-drawn animation. So for the sake of understanding that terminology, let's look at a very traditional example. In the old days, before computers, animators drew on paper, and their drawings were transferred onto transparent sheets of celluloid, or cells. This is where the term cell animation comes from. These would be layered together over a background painting, and that would get photographed onto a frame of a reel of film. A scene was made up of different layers of cells, similar to how our Harmony scene is made up of different drawing layers. You can think of each drawing layer you add as another cell you'd be adding to the stack. It's going to get a little more complicated than that, but in its most basic sense, that's what's happening. Now let's think about later down in the line when animation studios like Hanna-Barbera started making heavy use of limited animation. This means individual pieces of the character were drawn on different cells, so individual parts could be animated without needing to redraw the whole character. That's why Yogi Bear wears a necktie, to hide the seam between his head and his body. Let's look at how we might set this up in our scene. On our timeline, let's use this button to add a new drawing layer. We need to pick a name for our layer. Let's call it Head. Don't worry about these other options. We'll talk more about those in the drawing lessons. Now we have two options, Add and Close, or just Add. If we click Add and Close, it's going to add our layer and then close this dialog box. But if we just click Add, it adds our layer and assumes that we want to add another. This is an easy way to set up a lot of layers for our character. I'll add one for the body, and the right arm, and the left arm. Even though Harmony makes it fairly easy to hide the seams in our character, let's go ahead and give him a necktie anyway. Next, I'm just going to go in and draw each of those layers. And there we have it. Our character is set up on different layers. To keep it clear which layers are the character, we can change the layer color by double-clicking on the layer and bringing up the Properties window. This little square up here is where you can set a color for the layer. There, that looks much clearer. Now these layers aren't like our background layers. They should be kept together as a set. That's where our next timeline feature comes in. If we click this button, it will add something called a peg to our timeline. Let's name it Bear. The term pegs comes from traditional animation again. To keep drawings lined up, the paper and cells were punched with special holes to fit on a peg bar. So in Harmony, we use the term peg to refer to something that holds a stack of drawings together. Since I had the tie layer selected when I clicked the Add Peg button, it automatically attached the tie to the peg. But we need to make sure all the other character layers are attached to it as well. So we just shift-click to select them all, and then drag them up underneath it. Now we just need to make sure that they're all in the right order. There we go. Here in Harmony, our virtual peg bar gives us two advantages. One, it lets us click this little triangle and collapse these layers down to save space. And two, we can select the peg layer and use this Move tool. This moves all the drawing layers attached to that peg with it. We can also animate pegs by moving them with this Transform tool. We'll talk about animating pegs and drawing layers in a second. First, we're going to look at animating using a feature called Drawing Substitutions. So we have a character set up, but it's all just one frame. Let's say we want to make an animation of him blinking. To do that, we're going to need some more drawings. Again, think back to our traditional animation example. An animation is made up of a series of drawings. To animate the character, a cell would be photographed, and then the next drawing would be substituted in and photographed for the next frame. In Harmony, we build our drawing substitutions right into our layers. So let's say we want our whole animation to be 1 second. Since our frame rate is 24 frames per second, we're going to need 24 frames. Let's come out to frame 24 and we're going to right-click and select Extend Exposure. You could also use the keyboard shortcut F5. It's called Extend Exposure because back when animation was shot on film, each frame of film that was shot was called an exposure. So if you wanted a drawing on screen for 24 frames, it was a 24 frame exposure. Oops, we did it for the head, but we need to extend the exposure for the other layers too. I'm going to shift-click to select all these frames, and then use that F5 shortcut to extend their exposures too. So now, let's make our actual drawing substitution. Let's say we want the blink to start here at frame 12. Let's select that frame on the head layer, and then we can use one of these buttons. We could create a blank drawing, but then we'd have to redraw the whole head. This is where we're glad we're working digitally. Instead, I'm going to use this button to duplicate the drawing. You can tell it's a new drawing because of this little split in the layer. This point where it goes from the one drawing to the next is called a key exposure. You can add or remove them with these buttons here. You'll probably never need to use the Add button because it automatically adds a key exposure whenever you create a blank drawing or duplicate one. The Remove Key Exposure button will just set that frame back to whatever the previous drawing in the timeline is. I'm just going to undo that. Then I'll just come in and redraw the eyes. I'll go over all these drawing tools I've been using in the next section of the course. Now you might be thinking, couldn't we have put the eyes on a separate layer too? And you're right, we can separate the character into as many layers as we want. Every time you set up a character, you have to balance how much redrawing you want to do with how many layers you want to have to deal with. We'll talk about that when we get to the rigging characters section of the course. There, now we have a drawing substitution. We can drag our playhead back and forth to check how it looks. That looks good for a simple 2-drawing blink, but to be a blink, he needs to open his eyes again. So let's come out to say frame 16, and I'll show you something cool. Let's open our Library tab up here. Here in this panel, we have this slider that shows us all the drawing substitutions in this drawing layer. If we select our first drawing with the eyes open, we see it automatically added a drawing substitution on the timeline. You can also use the bracket keys on your keyboard to cycle through the different drawings in this layer. You have access to any drawing you've ever done anywhere on this layer, unless you've specifically deleted it from your library. If you do want to permanently delete a drawing from the library, just come down to the timeline, right-click, come to Drawings, and delete selected drawings. I don't actually want to do that right now, so I just won't. Keep in mind that this is the same drawing we used on frame 1, not a copy. Imagine the cameraman had taken the cell he photographed for frame 1 and just used it again for this frame. You can see if I change the drawing on either frame, then it changes on the other. And here on the timeline, we're seeing the name of each of our drawing substitutions. So you can see this frame at the start and this one we just substituted are in fact the same drawing. Now I mentioned before that we can also create motion by animating our pegs and layers. That's what these controls here are for. Let's think back to our traditional animation example. Instead of animating a character on a layer, we can animate the layer itself. We do that by using these keyframe buttons over here. Think of keyframes as instructions for how you want a motion to start and end. So let's say we want our bear to move within this frame. We just need to add some keyframes on his peg using this button. Let's go to frame 1 and add a keyframe with this button. Then we'll position the bear using this tool here. This will be our start position. Now we need to turn on our animate button again. With that on, we can come out here to some later frame and just move our bear layer using that tool again. And you can see it automatically set a new keyframe. That's what that animate button does. It sets a new keyframe anytime you move a layer or peg. You can see this line between our keyframes. That means the computer has figured out the in-between positions for all of these frames. If for some reason you aren't getting that line, select the first keyframe and click this button. This will make sure the keyframe is a motion keyframe. That means it'll get in between by the computer. So that's moving horizontally now, but since we're working digitally, we can do more than shift things around. We can use the Scale tool to change the size of our peg and all its drawings. That's not something they could do back in the physical drawing days. There, that's set. Now let's play back the animation and see how it looks. To do that, we look over here at our playback controls. We'll start by just pressing this play button. Oops, it looks like our timeline is longer than our animation. To fix that, we can just grab this red handle at the end of our timeline and drag it in to the 24 frame mark. And then we'll press play. There. If we wanted to play even a smaller portion of the timeline, we could set our start and end frames here, or click and drag these little black handles on our timeline. Then it will only play back the portion of the timeline that's within this section. But we really want to play back the whole thing, so let's reset these. We can also use this button to make our preview loop. If you don't want to play back at full speed, you can use this slider or this wheel here to move through the timeline forward or backward as fast as you want, depending on how far you push it. With more complicated animations, this could be handy. Good, but we're only playing in OpenGL mode. If we want to see a full-res beautiful version, we can use this button to render and play. This renders out all the individual frames and plays them in this separate window. Cool. So we've used keyframes to move our character peg, and within the head layer, we're using drawing substitutions to animate the eyes. This seems very simple now, but the fancy puppet rigging and the elaborate animations we're going to be doing later are really just extensions of these basic concepts. We'll go over those topics and the rest of all these crazy buttons in the animation lessons. Before we go, I want to show you a piece of the interface very closely related to the timeline, the XSheet. The XSheet is kind of an alternative to the timeline. If you don't see it, just right-click up here and choose it from the list. The XSheet is another way of laying out the contents of your animation. A paper XSheet is what traditional animators use to plan their animations, and it served as instructions for the cameraman. The X in XSheet stands for exposure, as in taking a photo on film. You can see it's basically a timeline turned vertically. You have a column here for every row in the timeline. You can get rid of columns by hiding the layer on the timeline. One advantage of the XSheet is that you can see the names of your drawing substitutions written out. Whereas on the timeline, you have to move to that frame in order to see the name here. For a bear's head, we could give these drawings new names by right-clicking and choosing Drawings, Rename Drawing. I'm going to name these Open and Closed. And you can see on our XSheet, we can see exactly where the eye is going to be open and then switch back to closed. If you end up doing a lot of drawing substitutions, you might find them easier to manage on the XSheet, where you can see which one is where. I'll show you more about the XSheet when we talk about hand-drawn animation later on. Hopefully at this point, you're a little more comfortable with the Harmony interface. Next, we're going to dig into our drawing tools and the different strategies for creating our artwork.